Hey guys, this is EckhartsLadder. Hello and welcome to another Star Wars rambling video. And for those who don't know, in my rambling videos, I don't really do a whole lot with video editing. I kind of just speak off script and you guys listen. So if you have somewhere to drive to or something to do, this might be good to listen to instead of how you would normally watch a video. And I'm doing today's video in this format because I'm just coming back from a break after my wedding. You can see pictures of that on Twitter and Instagram, by the way. And I have been having a few technical issues with this upload. So, the Yuuzhan Vong invaded at probably one of the worst times that they possibly could have. I mean, the very worst time would have been the Empire at its full power, but by the mid-20s ABY, the New Republic had recovered from the Galactic Civil War, they had a decently sized military, and Luke's Jedi Order was back in power. So, assuming that the Vong arrived at the galaxy at the same time they did, so not thousands of years earlier, when would the best time to have invaded been? One that I hear a lot is the pre-Clone Wars era, and I actually think that that would have been the worst. It is true that the Old Republic didn't have a standing military in the pre-Clone Wars era because of the Ruusan reformations. However, planets weren't defenseless, and the way that forces were actually distributed through the galaxy could have been somewhat of a benefit. So instead of a centralized navy made up of several constituent fleets like we saw with the New Republic or the Empire, planetary and system defense in the Old Republic era was the responsibility of individual planets. So Kuat, for example, would have had many dreadnoughts and star destroyers in service protecting its shipyards, but even smaller systems most likely would have had somewhat of a defense fleet. Now, when the Empire took power, most of these would have been dismantled, but what it means is that most planets at least won't be completely defenseless. This is actually somewhat of a benefit because it doesn't allow the centralized leadership of the Republic to make poor tactical decisions when it comes to distribution of resources. On the other hand, Borskvalia, Chief of State of the New Republic, failed to adequately recognize and respond to the Yuuzhan Vong threat, and thus the species was able to get a foothold in the Outer Rim. So instead of having one military controlled by a central force, we have thousands or millions of smaller individual armies, which I also think might help each other out as the invasion progresses. However, even more important to that, I think, is the fact that there's 10,000 or more Jedi ready for active service. This would have probably been the pinnacle of Jedi power. And we know specifically that the Jedi were seen by the Vong as their greatest adversary, and they went out of their way to eliminate the Order however possible. Luke had maybe a couple of hundred Jedi in his order at this point, and very few masters, especially of his level, but the Old Republic had an entire Jedi Council, hundreds probably of masters, and of course thousands of knights and Padawans. They would be able to oppose the Yuuzhan Vong basically across the entire galaxy during ground invasions. I think this era will have a bit of trouble when it comes to space combat, and they will be pushed back in some major battles. They don't have the number of dreadnoughts that the Empire and the New Republic had. They don't have the same high quality starfighters or even capital ships, but I think they will manage, just because they have a much more flexible defense, and more importantly, they have 10,000 plus Jedi. The pre-Clone Wars era is really the first point that the Vong could have invaded, but I don't think it would have been a great idea. Neither do I think would have been a Clone Wars invasion. Clearly, a force of this extreme coming from outside would have been sufficient to mobilize the Confederacy of Independent Systems and the Republic. It was at this point that the galaxy was more militarized than it had been in perhaps thousands of years, and even the Jedi were actually in active service roles. That's not even mentioning the fact that the Confederacy of Independent Systems used a droid navy and army, which would surely infuriate the Vong, who were technophobic, and would probably throw the invaders off their invasion plan. The only sort of intangible here is Palpatine, but I think there's nothing he would have done to make the galaxy lose their invasion. invasion. That remains true as the Republic transformed into the Empire. Some theories have said that Palpatine created the Death Star and other superweapons to oppose the Vong, and while that is a theory, even in universe, I don't think there is a real backing for it, as I've discussed in prior videos, but still weapons like the Death Star, or even the sheer amount of Star Destroyers and Super Star Destroyers, would have been incredible tools against the Yuuzhan Vong. The Empire was poorly set up to fight a small faction like the Rebel Alliance, however they're much more well suited for total war. What's more, one of the New Republic's greatest weaknesses was a lack of direct action, and the failure to deny the Yuuzhan Vong territory. I seriously doubt that Palpatine would underestimate the Vong, and we know that he has no problem destroying planets even for much lesser reasons. The one issue here is the lack of Jedi and even Force users in the galaxy, but I think the Empire is so conventionally strong that it can make up for this hurdle, especially with all the special weapons project that Palpatine was always working on, like the Dark Troopers. Speaking of, we don't know when the early phase Dark Troopers actually entered production, but given that they were essentially well-armored and well-armed droids, they probably could have served as some more basic sort of YVH shock troops, which I think would be quite useful. So the Imperial era was probably above all else the one time when the Yuuzhan Vong wouldn't have wanted to invade, and the aliens themselves even recognized this. I've talked about this in a prior video, but they basically said that Palpatine would have wiped them out. And I don't even think immediately after the Battle of Endor and the death of Palpatine would have been the preferred era. This is mostly because although the Empire was fractured, there were still tens of thousands of Star Destroyers running across the galaxy in the hands of several dozen warlords. The New Republic was growing stronger, and we know that individuals like Thrawn were able to unify large portions of the galaxy to fight together, so I believe that an alien invader would have done so as well. Still, the Empire was significantly weakened at this point compared to its prime, maybe not in ship numbers, although those certainly were down, but largely in organizational capacity. Another thing, of course, is the fact that Thrawn is around, and the Empire of the Hand has already been formed as a sort of buttress against any extragalactic threat. If the Vong come right after Endor, I think Thrawn probably reaches out both to the New Republic and the remnants of the Empire and forms a pretty cohesive defense. Still, it wouldn't be a terrible time for the Yuuzhan Vong to invade, probably even better than when they actually did, because the Imperial Remnant hadn't formed a sort of stable government, the New Republic hadn't totally militarized, and Luke hadn't started his order. But there's an even better opportunity, which the Vong themselves would have even observed. Thrawn's blitzkrieg caused absolute chaos within the New Republic, and his death did the same within the Empire. The Dark Empire source book reveals that some of this may have been planned by none other than Palpatine himself, who hoped to emerge with a secret fleet from the deep core and take the galaxy back as his domain. And in fact, this fleet and Palpatine's secret fleets across the galaxy would have been at least somewhat available for an invasion before this time, but it was during Operation Shadow Hand that Palpatine really played his hand. So Palpatine launched a devastating assault against the New Republic, attacking them on multiple fronts and even taking the planet of Coruscant, with dozens of dreadnoughts involved in action across the galaxy. However, soon after, there was a gigantic mutiny, which saw the Empire bleed thousands of ships and lose countless individuals. The New Republic too also sustained incredible losses not only in their capital city, but also in their fleet. As Dark Empire puts it, they were essentially put back into the position of rebels once again. So in Legends, one of the things that led to the Empire becoming a secondary faction over time instead of the primary galactic power was sort of a death by 1,000 cuts. It started with the destruction of the Death Star 1, where the Empire lost a ton of their top officers, lots of brain power and resources lost there. And we see the same thing happen, of course, with the Death Star 2 and the loss of the Executor, but perhaps even more than those, the ending beginning of Operation Shadow Hand, because basically most Imperial warlords flocked from across the galaxy to rejoin Palpatine in the core. Many of those individuals were killed, whether it was the destruction of Biss and its massive fleet, the destruction of the Galaxy Gun, and just various other events. Palpatine was dead, thousands of ships were lost, and the Essential Guide to Warfare really recognizes that it was this point where the Empire would never truly recover. Famed warlord Artus Kane, for example, died during Operation Shadow Hand, and many others had already died, like Warlord Zinj, or two perished in that year. But the New Republic was also whittled down majorly, so we have a galactic power now which is in total disorganization and which is seriously weakened. The New Republic lacks a centralized position of authority, they lack a true powerful fleet at this point. Palpatine is dead, a lot of the Dark Jedi are dead, and Luke still hasn't really gotten the Jedi Order off the ground. Also, a lot of fighting had been happening in the core, so the Outer Rim is probably as undefended as it's ever been. For all of these reasons, it represents the perfect time for the Yuuzhan Vong to have attacked. I'm not talking about 10 years later, I'm talking about like immediately after the destruction of Biss. Palpatine used the confusion caused by Thrawn's campaign and his death to make his move, and this is basically that, but on a much larger scale. The only thing the Vong have going against them is the fact that the New Republic still does technically have a few recovered World Devastators in their service, which they could use to start pumping out weapons. There's probably also more Dreadnoughts in service than there would be later, but still, I don't think that's nearly enough to turn the tide in the other direction. So, 11 ABY right after the destruction of Biss. If I were the Yuuzhan Vong, that's when I would have invaded. Almost a decade and a half before they actually did. One final thing I want to note right at the very end too is that there was a degree of cooperation between the New Republic and the Empire when the Vong invaded, given that it was right after a massive invasion that wouldn't be practical here. What's more, instead of being in the mid/outer rim, as the Imperial Remnant would later move under the command of Pelion, the Empire at this point was instead in the deep core, so basically very far away from the front lines of war. However, that's just my opinion. Does it make sense? Is it a little wonky? Am I overlooking some things? Perhaps the strength of the pre-Clone Wars era Republic? Let me know all of that and more down in the comments. That's all I have for you guys today. Regular videos soon, but until then, may the Force be with you.